Hi, welcome back to my channel. Now, many years ago, the British film critic Gilbert Adair described King Kong, the original King Kong with Fay Wray, as the 11th best film on every person's top 10 list. Which I think is a very kind of witty way of saying, there are loads of films out there that are very special, that everyone seems to like, that everyone thinks are major works of cinema, but which never make their way onto the top 10 of these lists. So I thought today I'd look at 10 more of these 11th best films of all time. The reason is because this month, Sight and Sound magazine is publishing the results of its 10-yearly poll of film critics, academics and programmers from around the world to pick their 10 best films. And this is what gave Citizen Kane its title as the best film ever made. Though actually last time they did it, in 2012, Vertigo by Hitchcock was nominated as the best film of all time. So we're waiting to see whether Vertigo holds on to that title. But in the meantime, here's some 11th best films ever made. First of all, Night of the Hunter, the only film ever directed by the actor Charles Laughton, one of the best actors of the 20th century. And this actually came second in a poll of Cahiers du Cinéma critics, the famous French film magazine. This is a one-off film, not just because it was the only film he directed. It's an extraordinary kind of fairy tale for adults, horror film for children. The main character is this little boy and this little girl, and their mother remarries this odious figure, this big bad wolf played by Robert Mitchum, who realises that the children know where some money is buried and he wants to get hold of it. And so he pursues them. And the whole film is told in this sort of rarefied fairy tale style, but grounded in Southern American realism. And I think that's what a lot of people find tricky about the film when they see it for the first time. I remember seeing this for the first time with my brother and his girlfriend and his girlfriend's mother. And halfway through the film, the mother turned around and said, "This film's silly." And I suppose it is silly, really, because it tells an adult drama in the manner of a child's fairy tale. But it's a lyrical film, and it has one of the most lyrical passages in film history when Mitchum is chasing the two children, and he comes to the side of this river. They manage to get into this little boat and pull away, and he lets out this huge howl like the big bad wolf. And then you get this beautiful sequence as the children travel down the river, watched over in the moonlight by the animals of the forest, a toad, a spider, a deer. Well, I think it's a rabbit, actually, sorry. Very beautiful scene. And then they meet Lillian Gish, the famous star of silent cinema. It's an extraordinary movie. Mitchum gives, I think, his finest performance in film. And it's a movie that has a texture and a quality like no other. It is visually stunning. And there are images that will stay with you. Shelley Winters, her dead body sitting in a car with her hair streaming in the current of the river. That is an image that will stay with you. The second film I want to look at is also a film about children caught in a terrible time. This is the time of the Spanish Civil War. This is a Spanish film, The Spirit of the Beehive, El Espíritu de la Colmena, by a director called Victor Erice, who is kind of the Terrence Malick of Spanish cinema. He makes a film about every 10 years or so. In fact, he hasn't now made a film since 1993, but apparently he's back in the saddle. This was his first film, made in the latter days of Franco, and it's set during the Spanish Civil War, just after the Spanish Civil War, actually. And this little girl has just seen Frankenstein at a travelling cinema in her village, and a deserter from one of the armies has holed out in a little shed in the local field, and she finds him and she thinks he's Frankenstein, and she looks after him. This is an extraordinary film. Almost everyone who sees it falls in love with it. It's shot by Luis de Cuadrado, and he was almost on the point of going blind when he shot it. It's got very gossamer light cinematography, and it's a beautiful little score by Luis de Pablo. And it's a very moving, haunting twilight film. Little Anna Torrent, who I think was only 5 years old when she appeared in it, one of the great child performances of history, and her amazing face came to be a symbol of, hope in Franco's world. She was also, of course, in Carlos Saura's Cría Cuervos about a couple of years later. an absolutely beautiful, moving film, a brilliant portrait of childhood and the vulnerability and the fragility of childhood. My third film on the list is a film by Orson Welles. Now, it might seem strange to be talking about an 11th best film when it comes to Orson Welles, because, of course, for years he had the #1 spot with Citizen Kane. But talk to any Welles enthusiast, and it's very likely that though they admire Citizen Kane, as I do, it won't be their favourite Welles film, i.e. the one they feel the most affection for or the most regard for. They either say the second film that Welles made, The Magnificent Ambersons, or they will say this, Chimes at Midnight, known simply as Falstaff in the US. This is Welles's adaptation of the Henry IV plays by Shakespeare, with bits of Richard II and Henry V put in. And Welles himself plays Falstaff. And this is both, I think, his greatest work as a director in terms of his warmest work as a director, and his greatest work as an actor. His Falstaff is incomparable. Because Welles, to a certain extent, was Falstaff, wasn't he? The big jolly man, the great jolly man who wanted wine, women and sack, who was a great man, a genius in his own way, but given to the laughter and the bawdry of life. And then he befriends Hal, the king's son, the Prince of Wales, and they have this wonderful time, and then suddenly Hal has to become king, and he rejects Falstaff. And the scene where he rejects Falstaff is extraordinary, one of the most moving sequences in film, and the expression on Welles's face is so right. He understands Falstaff so well. This is a portrait of merry England before the fall. Gielgud is brilliant as Henry IV. The battle sequence is famous and was quite influential. It's an extraordinary piece of cinema. Another director who is a regular fixture in the top 10 is Jean Renoir, the French director, usually for his film La Règle du Jeu. But many of us prefer this film, The River, and this is a film that, for those of us who are advocates or fans of it, this is more than just a great piece of cinema. It's almost a strange little Bible to live by. It's a very simple film. It's based on a sort of romantic, sort of slushy novel by Ruma Godden about a middle-class family, Raj family living in India. And this ex-American veteran from the Second World War, who's been injured in the Second World War, comes to stay. And the young 13-year-old girl of the family falls in love with him, and so does the neighbouring Indian girl next door. It's a tale of young love and a rite of passage for a girl sort of thing. Very simple, very straightforward, not very complex. The beauty of this film is in Renoir's treatment of that subject. And what emerges is a filmmaker who's very sensitive to India and its culture, and the most extraordinary scene in the film is where Radu, who was a dancer in real life, dances on film. It's incredible, it's so beautiful. But why I like this film, and I think why many people are drawn to this film, is it's a very rare film in cinema that is completely and utterly without cynicism or pessimism. It looks at the human condition with openness to everyone in it. It doesn't forsake truth. It shows the truth of the English in India. It shows the truth of society. It shows the truth of young love, and it shows the truth of death. Because a little boy in the family dies. The most beautiful sequence, because what it shows is everyone asleep in the noonday heat. And then the final images of the little boy himself lying as if asleep, but actually he's dead. Incredible sequence. It's so rare to find a work of art, especially from the 20th century onwards, that is without guile, without a sense of its own smartness or its intelligence, no irony, no pessimism, no cynicism, and is absolutely open to the truth of life. It's a very special film, The River. Next we're going to look at Taste of Cherry by Abbas Kiarostami. This was the film in the 90s that introduced the West to to Abbas Kiarostami and to the whole world of Iranian cinema, which had actually been going for about 20 years at that point but was unknown in the West. Now, you know what happens sometimes in cinema? A great director is discovered, like Kurosawa was in 1950 with Rashomon. And what happens is this film becomes famous, right? But then connoisseurs and cinephiles sort of go, well, actually, I mean, Kurosami's Taste of Cherry is marvellous, but there are other films by Kurosami that are just as good, if not more. They're better. Like Close Up, or the Coca trilogy, or The Wind Will Carry Us. I used to be a bit like that, right? I used to think that though this was the most famous one, there were other better ones elsewhere. But recently I did a retrospective of Kiarostami, and I watched all my Blu-rays and DVDs of Kiarostami from Where is the Friend's House onwards. I've not been able to locate Blu-rays of his previous work before that, sadly. And what I discovered was, actually this is the best. And this is the major film that Kiarostami produced, at least in my opinion. Now why? The film itself is very, very simple. It starts with a man driving around the outskirts of Tehran, looking for someone to do some work for him. We don't know what the nature of that work is for about the first 20 minutes. Is he really cruising for men? A sort of tension builds. And then he picks up this young cadet, this young soldier, and finally we learn what he wants. He wants the soldier to come back the next day and bury him after he's committed suicide. Suddenly the movie takes on a whole new atmosphere and aura. And we watch as he talks to various men, various labourers, often immigrants into Iran, about doing this work of job for him. And why I think Taste of Terror is the best film is it's moving and it's beautiful. But it's also the sort of confluence, the critical mass of everything that Kiarostami tried to achieve throughout his career. It has the social realism of Where is the Friend's House, in its observation of these migrant workers working on the outskirts of Tehran. But it also has the sort of meta-interest of Kiarostami in the work of cinema and the work of tricking the audience, especially in its very famous ending, which he almost didn't put in. People asked him not to do it, where he it's like he almost pulls back the drapes and shows the trick, almost, of the film. And it's also a piece of poetry. The filming of the landscape, the rocks and the rubble, is extraordinary. This cover shows him emerging out of the dust. And it's like a work of Persian poetry from the modern day. It's an extraordinary movie. Talking of extraordinary movies, Celine and Julie Go Boating, made by Jacques Rivette in France in the 1970s. This is a very strange movie to describe, one of the oddest movies you will ever see. Yet, what's interesting about it is that many critics love this film, many very different critics who often disagree with each other from different walks of cinema, if you like. So Jonathan Rosenbaum, very cinephile critic, loves this movie. David Thompson of the Biographical Dictionary of Film, a much more sort of literal-minded critic, but he also loves this movie. What's it about? It's about these two ladies here, two young women in Paris. They seem to meet by accident, but they obviously know each other, and it's like they're playing out a ritual game between themselves. At one point, they start eating this little sweet, and when they eat the sweet, they find themselves in this drama being played out in this dilapidated house among this middle-class family, a middle-class family who look like they're dead. And there's some kind of rather pot-boiler mystery going on with some poison. And the film keeps coming out of this drama and going back into it. How can I describe this movie? It's a bit like a work of jazz. You know how jazz is a piece of music that has a strong strain, a melody running through it, and then they keep improvising off it and fractaling off it and trying different permutations. That's what this movie is like to watch. And that makes it sound hard work. It's actually light as air. It's great fun. Juliette Berthaud and Dominique Labourier are wonderful in it. And Rivette and his two actresses work together, semi-improvising, semi-creating this kind of free-floating narrative that could go anywhere at any time. It's an extraordinary film. It's like a children's adventure that is actually groundbreaking in this adult world of cinema. It's an extraordinary movie. Next up, Point Blank. by John Borman. This movie, I think, is the movie that brought together the American cinema of Hollywood, the narrative cinema of Hollywood, and the sort of more free-form Nouvelle Vague cinema and modern cinema that was emerging in Europe. Now, often people credit Bonnie and Clyde by Arthur Penn with this, but I think this is a much better example because Borman is far more free-form and experimental in his form in this movie than Arthur Penn was in Bonnie and Clyde. This is best known as a revenge film, and it's probably the best revenge film. But actually, people forget how experimental Borman is in this movie. He really pushes it, you know. And there's so many sequences in this film that I remember really well. Like, you know, Marvin, you know, stomping down that corridor. Boom, 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 boom. And then you cut forward to the woman he's going to, you know, threaten. And it's amazingly stylistically and formally odd, you know. Every sequence is strange. And Lee Marvin responds to this, a well-known heavy actor by this point in Hollywood. He gives an incredible performance. It's a brilliant example of an actor in tune with what his director is trying to do, right? And what he does is he pares down his performance to the point where he's almost like a zombie, right? I think there's an apocryphal story that he got rid of some of the dialogue that was originally in the script. Something that's very unusual for an actor to do, right? But he did it because the idea of the film is that this is a man coming back from the dead, perhaps literally. And he's obsessive, like all he wants is his $93,000. Someone's got to pay. And so Marvin brings down the performance, contrasting with the playfulness of Borman's direction. It's a brilliant counterpoint. And he's just this relentless zombie, just getting his money. It's a brilliant, intense, concentrated performance by Marvin. I love the moment where Angie Dickinson is sort of beating on him, trying to get some reaction, and Marvin's just standing there like, what the hell's going on? I love this film. I go back to it again and again and again. I think it's maybe Borman's best work, actually. An extraordinary film. Next, we have a double bill. Both of the films on this double bill could be an 11th best film of all time. There's La Jetée, a famous science fiction film directed by Chris Marker, who was a documentarist and essay filmmaker. But he made this one science fiction film, which is only half an hour long, and is completely made up of still photographs. It was actually the film that inspired 12 Monkeys by Terry Gilliam. So if you've seen that film, you'll know what happens. And it's about a man who is in the future and he's sent back into the past to correct a murder of a man, or to go back and to look at this as an image in his mind of an incident, and he's sent back there to find out what happened. And there's a complication, and it's all told in still photographs. It's one of the most beautiful films ever made, and it's interesting that films are made up of, you know, pictures, frames, right? And this is a film that is made up itself of still photographs, yet it's still as cinematic as anything you will ever see. But also there's Sans Soleil, Sunless. Now this is an essay film that Chris Marker made, and it's in the form of a letter back to a friend, this American narrator, and it's just telling her about his travels between Japan, Africa and Iceland, with footage from all three countries. Just a reflection on the modern day world. It was made in the early 1980s. I guarantee anyone who watches this film is moved by it. And it's an extraordinary work. There's scenes in this film that come back to me and haunt me. There's one brilliant scene where he talks about the look a man gives him across a bar in this sort of port. The look of someone who has no betters here, and everyone who comes into the bar is his equal. And he knows it. And it freeze frames on his stare. An extraordinary moment of humanism in cinema. These two movies could both be 11th best movies of all time. Next, now this is a film, The Colour of Pomegranates, also known as Sayat Nova. Sayat Nova was a poet in the 1700s in Armenia, I believe. And this is a kind of quasi-biopic of his life, but if that makes it sound like a normal biopic, then forget it, because there is no narrative in this film at all, really. There are a series of tableaux vivants, which are more mythical and symbolic and metaphoric in meaning than they are literal. This is one of the most beautiful films you will ever see. The colours, my God, the compositions, it is extraordinary. It's totally worth this massive package here that it's been given. The first time you see it, you will struggle to understand anything. It does help if you know a little bit about Sayat Nova's life. But it doesn't really matter. Just immerse yourself in the sensual pleasure of this movie. It is extraordinary. There is no other movie quite like it. Actors double and triple themselves across the movie, playing different parts. It's a movie that's indescribable, really. You have to experience it for yourself. But this is definitely one of the 11th best movies ever made. Finally, Satan Tango by Béla Tarr. Béla Tarr was already an established filmmaker when he made this film in the 90s, a kind of 7.5-hour masterpiece. It's based on a novel by Laszlo Krasznokaj, which was written in the 80s, which is an extraordinary novel, and I strongly advise people to read it. It's a little bit different to the film, but what is astonishing about the film is how faithful it is to the novel, and how Krasznokaj and Tarr seem to have the same sensibility. They could even be the same person. It's extraordinary. You can't believe that there was a film that was so suited to a particular filmmaker. It's set in what was a communal farm in the bog days of communism in Hungary. And this one guy comes and he tries to get all the money off the others and walk away. They all think he's some kind of messiah. They think he's a great leader. But actually he's cheating them. He's conning them. And he walks off with all their money and they're left absolutely destitute and miserable. It is the most miserablest and bleak film you will ever see in your life. The entire 7.5 hours is set in a crumbling, crappy old village where it's always raining. There's always puddles everywhere and mud everywhere. Everyone looks like shit and miserable. Why would you watch this? Why is this film so highly regarded by everyone who sees it? Because there is no experience quite like it. It's an extraordinary, certainly a pessimistic vision of the world, but one that is so full and self-contained that it almost reaches epic proportions. Even though the story is so small scale, it's a film that takes time to look at people and cows and just, the gritty physical reality of life. The book, I think, is a teeny bit more impressive than the film, if I'm going to be very honest. But this is a major cinematic work if you've never seen it. And finally, you know what? This is about the 11th best films of all time. I've done 10 films, why can't I have an 11th? So I am going to. I'm going to indulge myself. Cat People by Jacques Tourneur. Now, this is a little B-movie horror flick from the early 1940s. How can I be proposing this as one of the 11 best films of all time? Cat People, in its own quiet way, modernised cinema. Certainly American cinema. If you think before this film, horror films were old-fashioned. They were taking their stories from Europe, right? Dracula, the werewolf, Frankenstein. Cat People broke with that. In fact, it's actually kind of about breaking with that. It's about a young immigrant who comes to America from Romania, I think, and she carries with her this curse from her people that whenever she gets sexually aroused, she turns into a big cat. But she marries an American, she lives in New York, and the whole film is set in New York. And it's set in everyday New York, with everyday people. This is a groundbreaking step forward in the horror film. And by doing so, it's kind of a groundbreaking step forward in American cinema, right? It's throwing off the shackles of old narratives and old stories. It thrusts us into a new world where we talk about psychoanalysts, a new world of the young woman in the modern city. It's so fresh and new. People think of it as a little horror movie, but actually, in its modernity and its look at modern people, it's actually as groundbreaking in its own little way as Citizen Kane. So that's my 11th best film of all time. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I'm looking forward to seeing the Sight and Sound list. But Below, I will give you my own top 10 films of all time, and I'd love to hear from you. What are yours as well? Thank you.